morning, everyone. Welcome to the Network of Politicized Adoptees virtual rally in support of the Indian Child Welfare Act. My name is Mari Arneson. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm joining you all from St. Paul, the original lands of the Anishinaabe and Dakota peoples, who are still here today. We have resources with Zoom tips and how to enable closed captions in the chat. But quickly, you can change to speaker view in the upper right corner of your screen and enable closed captions from the bar on the bottom. Please feel free to message the co-hosts directly if you have any tech issues, questions. And we encourage, if something they say resonates, give them some pluses or exclamation marks in the chat, and then or react with a feel free to ask questions in the chat throughout the event as well. We will have someone tracking the chat so that we can follow up on the questions when we get to the Q&A part of the rally components. So please have your cell phone nearby. And now I'm going to turn it over to my fellow NPA steering committee member, Margie.
Hello, everyone. Welcome again. My name is Margie. I also go by my Korean name, Unju. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm joining you from Minneapolis, the original lands of the Anishinaabe and Dakota peoples. So excited to be co-emceeing tonight's rally with Mari. We are both a part of NPA. NPA was founded in 2011 and works at the intersection of adoptee rights and social justice. Our mission is to strengthen, cultivate, and improve the lives of adoptees by building community power. We do this by telling our own stories and collectively working towards systemic change within adoption. We are grassroots, completely all volunteer, and based in the Twin Cities. At NPA, we see Indigenous and adoptee struggles as interconnected. We feel strongly about protecting ICWA, and when we heard it was being challenged by the Supreme Court, we were concerned along with so many of you, and we're moved to create this space tonight. So tonight we are gathering community, not only to learn about ICWA, but to take action as a group. We're honored to have many speakers join us tonight to help us take action together. But first, to help ground our rally today, we've invited Sun Young Shin to offer a poem, to bring some art into our space to kick us off. For those that might not know, Sun Young Shin is a poet, writer, and educator. She was born in Seoul, Korea, during Park Chung-hee's military dictatorship and through the mechanisms of the transnational adoption industrial complex, was made adoptable and then sent as a legal alien to the United States to live with white Christian strangers in the suburb of Chicago. She is the author of 4 poetry collections, 2 picture books, and is the co-editor of multiple books related to adoption, race, and immigrant stories. We'll drop a link in the chat to her full bio and works so you can support her. The poem she'll be sharing tonight with us is from her recent poetry collection, The Wet Hex.
An orphan receives her commercial DNA test results from 2 companies in Abecedarian. Ancestry laid upon a curse, a jinx, blood and another thing molten. Reveries of my face, the facade behind my face. Called to account the countries, deviations of echolocations, dead, mine, dark detained, ever banked in an ethnographic afterlife. Fell, deep sleep postponing my rewrite, rotate, mutate, genes to be circumnavigated by spit-polished explorers. How is a child's globe a work of colonial conditioning? In this condition, the wet hex in miniature jumps from gene sequence to succession, pattern recognition, kinship, failing upriver, descent. Life maps itself in vials sent via the real mail archaic method homesick for the gold horses of its origins. Never miscalculate genealogical disruptions, inability. Orphan your ancestors in the underworld, above who tends graves, pours the prayer of soju when the dead need music. Shall this be our final quarry, silent as a doe and daughter, reading the light, sowing a shade, a haunting, sold to a centrifuge, the sterile shine of its exposed aperture. Now travel to the Neanderthal, witness the heavy brow boned branch fork and break. Our dead underestimate us. Time machines drifting at the rate of future's arrival. Venn diagrams of past and speculation. Where will we repose? Collected, finger and jawbone, dusted dictionary, xenomorph, alien self, foreign. You, incarnate in the disciplined nation of the contemporaneous stranger, zealous for the sweet peace of the unborn, as yet unburied. Thank you.
Dan Leverance, who will offer a brief overview of ICWA and the specifics about the upcoming Supreme Court case. Dan Leverance is a member of the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska. He is an assistant professor of law at the University of North Dakota Law and a contract attorney at the Native American Rights Fund, or NARF. Dan has worked with NARF on the Bracken litigation since it was first filed in 2017. And before that, he helped defend the Indian Child Welfare Act as an attorney for the U.S. Department of the Interior. Dan earned his undergraduate degree from Kansas State University and his law degree from the University of Wisconsin Law School. Welcome, Dan. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mari. I'm so happy to be here and so glad to have your invitation to speak with this group. Like she said, I'm going to start with a little bit of a background of the Indian Child Welfare Act and then talk to you about this case and some of the problems that it poses. The Indian Child Welfare Act was enacted in 1978 after several years of Congress studying the problem that we now refer to as the Indian child removal crisis. Now, Indian child removal was not something new in the 20th century. It goes back hundreds of years to policies that took children off to schools far away from their homes, often to try and assimilate them into American society. In the words of Colonel Pratt, the founder of the first big Indian school, to kill the Indian to save the man. Those policies continued into the 20th century and are at the root of the child removal crisis. But the child removal crisis really emerges in the 1950s and 60s when state child welfare agencies and private adoption agencies began actively working to remove Indian children from their Indian families, their tribal communities, and to deliberately place them with non-Indian families, often as far away from their reservations as possible. I do want to pause for a moment to talk a little bit about the language that I'm using. I am an attorney and I am a law professor, and we frequently use the word Indian because our legal documents use this word. The Constitution refers to Indian tribes and Indians who are members of their own tribes as Indians not taxed because they're not subject to the local governments. Over time, terminology changes. I worked for an organization called the Native American Rights Fund, and once Native American was the popular term. Today, we sometimes use indigenous. But this statute refers to Indians. My grandfather still says that he's an Indian. He says he's too old to try and be anything else today. And so that's the word we use when talking about this statute. In the 1970s, organizations that David Simmons and I work with today, including the Association on American Indian Affairs, brought to Congress voluminous evidence of all of these removals of Indian children, often without any due process for their families, often without any notice to the tribes that had equal responsibility as the states for these children. And so Congress knew that it needed a way to protect Indian families, to preserve the rights of Indian tribes as governments to decide the fate of their own children. And it passed the Indian Child Welfare Act to do that. Now, the Indian Child Welfare Act does a number of things. One is it lays out some jurisdictional boundaries. It says certain children are subject only to the powers of their Indian tribe and not to any state court. Other children, particularly those who live away from reservations, are simultaneously within the jurisdiction of both the tribal court and a state court. And the Indian Child Welfare Act provides procedures for deciding which is going to be the best venue to hear about a particular child's case. And when a case remains in state court, the Indian Child Welfare Act provides a number of minimum federal safeguards for those procedures involving Indian children. For example, the parental rights of a parent to an Indian child cannot be terminated without giving notice both to the parent and to the tribe, without without performing active efforts to make sure that the family can be kept together, and without evidence from a qualified expert witness that the child has to be removed from that family, or there will be serious consequences for the child. Those procedures have to be followed before a parent's rights can be terminated. The Indian Child Welfare Act also provides a set of placement preferences for both foster care and adoptive placement. They're slightly different from one to the other. But generally speaking, the Indian Child Welfare Act says courts should try to place a child with a member of that child's family. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean an Indian member of that child's family. Many of our tribal members are the result of mixed marriages, and a non-Indian member gets, or the non-Indian parent, the non-Indian family gets the same preference as the Indian family. The point is to try and keep family together when that's possible. Now, we all know that unfortunately that's not always possible. And so the next preference is to keep an Indian child with a member of that child's tribe. That helps to ensure that they remain a part of that community. And if that's not possible, then a preference for placement with other Indian families. This really is at the heart of this lawsuit that's being filed today. Some non-Indian potential adoptive parents of Indian children feel like the Indian Child Welfare Act discriminates against them. They say that the Indian Child Welfare Act creates racial categories. One category for Indians, and in particular Indian children, and a separate category made up of everyone else, and that everyone else ends up being discriminated against because they have reduced access, a higher burden to adopt an Indian child. Now, we sometimes talk about Indian adoption in the framework of transracial adoption, and you'll hear more about that today. But the Supreme Court has long said that when Congress writes legislation with respect to Indian tribes and their members, that's not really a racial distinction. In fact, they say there is a connected political chain between the federal government and those tribal members, a political recognition by the federal government of the Indian tribe, which the government deals with as a fellow sovereign. and a relationship between that tribal member and their tribe, a relationship that mirrors the citizenship that we may have to the United States, to our state, to another country. And it's that continuous chain of political relationships from the United States to tribe, from tribe to tribal member, that undergirds the relationship between the federal government and Indians, that's not a racial relationship. The other big argument in this case has to do with the role of the federal government and the state governments. The plaintiffs claim that the Indian Child Welfare Act steps on state powers. And it is a complicated case because we typically think of these sorts of family law and child welfare relationships as being a part of a state law framework. But remember that Congress from the very beginning of this country has legislated with respect to Indian children. It's enacted treaties that provided certain benefits to Indian children, provided for the education of Indian children and for the care of Indian orphans in some treaties, that it passed those very laws that removed Indian children from reservations and sent them to boarding schools. No one was saying that violated the relationship between the federal government and the states. And the last thing I'll say about this case is that it poses a real threat beyond just the Indian Child Welfare Act and that law that protects Indian children. But the way the plaintiffs argue this case, if they succeed in saying that the category of tribal members is a racial category, then almost everything that sets Indians apart, the things that we have fought for in wars, that we negotiated for in treaties, all of that would be called into question because there no longer would be a way for the United States to deal with Indians on a non-racial basis. If the category of tribal members is a racial category, then almost all of Indian law and tribal governance may fall away. That's sort of my quick explanation of a very complicated statute and a very complicated Supreme Court case. I'm going to turn it over to my fellow presenters now because they've got a lot of great information to share with you, and I'm happy to take questions from you later on in our program. Thanks, Mari.
Thanks so much, Dan. Really appreciate your way of breaking that down for us. And yes, see some questions coming in and encourage folks to keep asking some questions. We'll keep track of those in the chat and make sure we get to those in the Q&A part of our evening. So I want to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Kim Park Nelson. She is an educator and researcher whose work uses adoption as a lens to understand race and culture. Her work has contributed to building of the field of adoption studies and Korean adoption studies in the US and internationally. She has authored or co-authored several published articles on adoption cultures and communities. She is director and associate professor of ethnic studies at Winona State University. Dr. Kim Park Nelson has partnered with NPA to offer community courses on American transracial transnational adoptee history, linking domestic transracial adoption to overseas transracial adoption, including the passage of ICWA in 1978. We're excited to have her join us to help make some of these connections to our adoptee community. Welcome, Dr. Kim Park Nelson.
Thank you, Margie, and thank you everybody at NPA and the other organizers of this rally. It's really an honor for me to have this opportunity to show my solidarity for Protect ICWA. Just briefly talk about and outline why should folks who aren't Native care about the end of ICWA. And this is something that I always teach about in my adoption classes because I do believe that what has happened in our American adoption history domestically also affects those of us who are overseas adoptees. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a Korean adoptee who came to the United States and grew up in the state of Minnesota in St. Paul in 1971. And so if you look into the history of transracial and transnational adoption with the United States, within the United States and the United States as a receiving country, you'll see a long history of abuses of power against communities of origin in these practices, and that has led the United States to kind of lead the world in developing an adoption industry that really has a tendency to prey upon vulnerable communities as sort of source communities for adoptable children. Excuse me, Dan mentioned in his very concise and clear breakdown of the ICWA case that is going to be coming before the Supreme Court, that ICWA was enacted in the 70s, in 1978. Some of you might also know that the National Association of Black Social Workers, sometimes abbreviated as NABSW, and NABSW, also in the 1970s released a statement condemning Black to white transracial adoption in the United States. And I really see these policy statements and this legislation that came about in the 1970s as responses from communities of origin for adoptable children that basically stood up and said, no, we do not agree with the removal of our children from our communities to be adopted into white homes. And I think this was a really key moment in our adoption history. What happened as a result, or I guess my perception of what happened as a result of those, when those American communities took a stand with respect to child removal from their communities, is the adoption industry went overseas. Even though Korean adoption had started in the 1950s, immediately following the Korean War, with Korean War armistice in 1953. Korean adoption became very, very popular and common in the 1980s after ICWA was passed, after there had been these kind of community-based critiques around transracial adoption within the United States. And I think that, it's not too big of a stretch to think, well, if the same community of adopters still has the same kind of demand for adoptable children, when those sources dry up in one place, that market is going to push that industry to look for children in other places. And that's exactly what's happened. The reason there's so many Korean adoptees in the United States and especially here in the state of Minnesota is because of this huge kind of wave of Korean adoptees that came in the 1980s and is still happening today. So, Korea is a country that has like the longest running international adoption program. Other scholars have noted that this movement of children from Korea to the United States actually represents the largest single migration of children in the world. I really see ICWA as such an important piece of American policy around adoption. Not only because, as Dan mentioned, it's really about tribal sovereignty and the relationship between American Indians and the U.S. government, but it also shows a respect for the self-determination of communities of origin for adoptable children that I really think should be standardized in all of those communities and all of those locations. So I feel like I've maybe gone a little bit over my time, so I'm going to stop now. But thanks again to NPA for inviting me to come here, and I'm looking forward to hear what David has to say, and then also to answer any questions that you all have at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim, for helping us make connections between the transracial, transnational, adoptee community and ICWA, and talk about why we should really all care. Our next speaker is David Simmons, who will be sharing more insights on why protecting ICWA matters and what we can all do to take action and support ICWA. David has over 30 years of professional experience in child welfare services as a direct service provider and in program and policy development. His primary focus has been on improving child welfare and children's mental health services to American Indian and Alaska Native children. He currently is the Director of Government Affairs and Advocacy at the National Indian Child Welfare Association in Portland, Oregon, and works extensively with tribal, federal, and state governments and private organizations. Thank you for joining us, David.
There we go. Sorry about that. I wanted to just start by saying I'm also feel very privileged to be here too. And I want to share a little bit of information with you about at the National Indian Child Welfare Association, how we think about child welfare and adoption more specifically. I also want to share with you a little bit of information. You've heard some from Dan already, but a little bit about the failed federal policies and then kind of some of the state failed policies that have in turn both created great harm for Native communities. And then I also want to connect a little bit with you on a more personal note, some of my own experience working in the field of child welfare as a caseworker and some of the things I've seen. And then I want to invite all of you to join with us at the Protect ICWA campaign to support the Indian Child Welfare Act, to defend it. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that. We'll have some resources for you too. One of the things I learned very on as a new social worker is that, in my work, I was going to be working with a lot of very vulnerable families. And that in child welfare, we should always be concerned about a child's connection to their family, their community, and their culture. So that was the teaching I got. So then when I went to start working in the field, I started to see that sometimes we weren't always following the teaching. And what I mean by that is I saw that there were a number of very common practices in child welfare that I thought were highly destructive to families. Things like blaming extended families for, birth parents' problems, not trusting that people who are different from you, communities that are different from you, don't have solutions and value and resource for children who need help. And these were all things that I knew had great potential to create harm. And they also missed opportunities for us to help heal the children and the families who were part of that system. So, adoption plays a special role in child welfare, but it's too often misused, even when the intentions may be good. So when you think about when we remove a child from their home, even though we may be doing it for a good reason to protect them, to keep them safe, we're still creating some trauma in their lives. So as we do these things, we should be giving as much attention as possible to how we can reduce that and improve their lives. At the National Indian Child Welfare Association, we like to say that permanency is defined for a child not by the system or other people in the system, but by the child themselves. And that we need to make sure that we are considering all of the child's needs across the spectrum, both short-term and long-term, not just while they are a young person. So as we think about, and as I think about, the failed policies that have created some of these situations and the need for the Indian Child Welfare Act, it goes back well over 100 years. Dan talked a little bit about the boarding schools that operated for almost 100 years and forcibly removed, not voluntarily, forcibly removed Native children from their families and communities. And then following that, and part of that, were the attempts to try and adopt Native children out with the Indian Adoption Project, which started in the 1950s and continued in the 1960s. Hundreds of Native children were placed, put on trains, and then sent to places far from their communities, and then adopted by mostly white families. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, who conducted and supported these policies, thought that this was progressive thinking at the time. It was the Indian Adoption Project was some of the first transracial adoption policy on the federal level in the United States. And then also, if that wasn't enough, the relocation era, which started to take effect in the 50s and then certainly in the 60s and 70s, sought to encourage and move Native families away from their tribal communities into urban areas. Well, all of these things contributed to the sense of isolation, the disconnection that Native children and families felt. And if you can imagine, we're talking about generations of families here, of course. What happens when you remove people from the natural helping systems, and also when you remove them from the supports that they're used to? Then you remove them from the teachings, the information, the ability to practice and learn how to be parents themselves. And this is one of the things that we see in the residuals of these policies, is the dislocation of Native people from not just their culture, but from their ability to succeed as adults as well. So as these failed policies, that which were thought to be progressive thinking, occurred, we also saw an increasing understanding of the Indian Child Welfare Act as what we now call the gold standard in child welfare. It's one of the only federal child welfare laws that actually seeks to address bias in decision-making by child welfare systems, and requires public and private child welfare systems to address the comprehensive needs of Native children. So it thinks about the best interest, what is in the best interest of Native children, beyond sort of discrete things like proximity to their community, and actually applies the thinking of what does it mean to be a Native person, to grow up as a Native person, to be part of a Native community. And so for Native adoptees, the Indian Child Welfare Act also provides an additional protection, and it has a provision that allows them to petition the court after their adoption was finalized and seek information to help them establish their relationship. And oftentimes this leads to a connection with their extended family as well. So this is something that happens even in states where there are closed adoption systems. And it doesn't matter if you were adopted before the Indian Child Welfare Act was enacted or after, it provides you with that protection. So now I want to give you a little bit of my own connection to some of the work. So as a new social worker in Portland, Oregon, I worked in a residential facility in the 1980s. I saw firsthand the power of having a connection to your birth family and community can have. A Native and African-American youth that was on my caseload was not able to be reunified with his birth parents. There were a lot of conversations about what was going to happen next, and adoption was considered to be the plan. And most likely, it was thought would likely be with a family that this young man was not connected to, was not part of his family. He was definitely old enough to understand what that meant, and he struggled to imagine a positive future for himself. Despite all of our good intentions, by myself and other social workers in the agencies, we were never very successful at helping him heal or address the trauma of the past. But fortunately, he had an aunt in a nearby state that was determined to be a support for him. She would visit every month and help him understand who his family was and his place in that family. The aunt was not able to be an adoptive placement for him, but made it clear that she wanted to be in his life. Her presence gave him something that we could not, a sense of his identity, a place in the world, and skills to help him survive in a world that's not always kind to people of color. So as an adult adoptee myself, while I had many privileges that that young man did not, I share a sense of what it means to not have a connection to my birth family. My own adoption was done at a time when sharing information with adoptees was thought to be problematic at best, and withholding information was thought to be a strategy that would protect me and help me bond with my adopted family better. The Indian Child Welfare Act recognizes the very serious flaws in that thinking and seeks to support a future for Native adoptees that gives them a greater opportunity to determine their own future and nurture the connections that give them strength, support, and knowledge that we all need to live a life that we choose for ourselves. While listening to numerous adult adoptees throughout my career, I understand the pain that comes when you feel disconnected and the joy that finding that connection with your family and tribe can bring. And so it's important that as you're thinking about how you can present or how you can support the Indian Child Welfare Act, that you can also probably draw upon some of your own experiences too as an adoptee. Okay, so now I want to give you the information about how you can support ICWA. So the Protect ICWA campaign has a number of tools and information for all of you in this effort. And you'll be joining a diverse coalition of people who believe in the value of the Indian Child Welfare Act for Native children. As you heard, our opponents are trying to steal the protections that ICWA provides Native children, families, and tribes, and take us back to a time when it was easy to separate Native children from their families and even encouraged. You'll see a link to a petition that the Protect ICWA campaign is supporting and the QR codes for following us on social media. Please tell everyone you know about this very important issue and campaign. We need everybody's help. November 9th, the day of oral argument, is not far away. We need your help, and we need to develop and grow and increase our coalition. This is not a fight just for Native children and families, but this is also a fight for all of us to move away from the outdated and flawed thinking that still permeates many child welfare systems and move closer to what we know works and is needed. Over my career, I've seen a slow movement to the protections that ICWA provides in federal policy, but we aren't there yet, not yet. And we need to defeat those who would take us back to a time where outsiders think they know what's best for us. So I want to thank everybody in the Protect ICWA campaign. I want to thank NPA for having me today and ask that if you have any questions after this, please mail Protect ICWA at Rally, where Rally? That's how, and you'll see that also that in your email or your chat too. I want to thank you for listening today and stop here and just ask if there are any questions.
Thanks so much, David, for sharing a lot of our history and making those connections, and also sharing some of your personal story. Really appreciate that. We're just noting that in the chat, there's a lot of links for you to follow that were shared there. And if you got that QR code, what we're actually at time for is the Q&A part of our evening. And so now is the time. We just heard from some amazing speakers. So please put your questions in the chat, and Mari and I will be lifting up some of the questions asked. We might not be able to get to all of the questions, but we'll make sure that you have resources and ways to connect with us after this. As you're thinking of questions to put in the chat, one question that came up earlier, I'll direct to Dan to answer quick. The question was, can we tune in to watch the hearing on November 9th? Dan, would you like to answer that?
Yes, you can tune in. The U.S. Supreme Court used to not live stream. It's one of the things that changed in the pandemic. And this year, although they are opening the gallery of the court to live visitors, they are also going to continue to stream audio of their arguments. So if you go to the U.S. Supreme Court's website, that's supremecourt.gov, one of the buttons you will see right in the middle of the front of the page is live audio. And you can tune in for that argument on Wednesday, November 9th, 10 a.m. Eastern. You're all in a bunch of time zones, so I'm not going to translate those for you.
And there was another question earlier from Catherine, and it was, how does this threat to ICWA undermine tribal sovereignty? I think we touched on it a little bit, but I think if we could expand a little bit more.
Well, I'm happy to take that question. I think one of the things that's important to recognize, and Dan really highlighted this in his presentation, is that when children or non-native children are in a child welfare system, it's usually assumed that the government that they belong to will be there to help support and protect them. So if you're a non-native child, you come into a child welfare system, the state is supposedly there to help and protect. The same is true for native children as well. when they find themselves and their families in child welfare systems, they also need their tribal governments there as well. What the folks in this lawsuit are trying to do is to remove that distinction. They want to say that tribal governments don't have the right to be involved in proceedings in state court, to work with the agencies that are working with their children and families. And so it would essentially just remove them completely from that process. So that means really important decisions of like, what kinds of placements will these children have? Where will they receive services? Will those services be the appropriate services? All of those things would be taken away, and it would be assumed, of course, that state child welfare systems would know what was in the best interest of Native children rather than tribal governments.
Kim or Dan, would you like to add to that?
No, I think that was a good answer, David.
Great. So we see another question about watch groups and parties, and I think we're noting that. I'm not aware of any right now, but I'm hearing that request. I don't know if the other speakers know of any kind of watch parties in particular. Checking.
I am not aware of any. I know that a number of us are hoping to be in DC for the arguments, and so that's kind of decreased my interest in hearing it anywhere else.
Okay, thanks, Dan. We have a question here around what do you think the likelihood is for ICWA getting overturned, and maybe kind of thinking about if it is, what could we do, about that, or what would be the next steps, if that happens to be the case. Dan, would that be a question to you?
Probably as good for me as anyone. It's hard to predict. It's always hard to predict what's going to happen. Well, not always, I guess, in the Supreme Court. But in part in Indian law cases, because they don't break down on traditional liberal conservative lines. The last time the Indian Child Welfare Act was in the Supreme Court, one of the liberal justices joined a number of conservatives in a majority that limited the application of the Indian Child Welfare Act. It was a very disappointing decision for us. And one of the most conservative justices ever, Justice Scalia, who ordinarily is not seen as being a friend to Indians, voted on the Indian side. And in his dissent, said that he thought the majority was making it too easy to take children away from loving parents who had not been found to be unfit. He said, that's not what we do. As long as a parent is fit, we allow them to raise their children. And so when we look at this current court, there are some justices who we feel very good about because of their record on Indian law cases. There are a couple of justices we think that it's going to be really hard to try and win them because of some of the things they've written in Indian law cases. Some of the arguments in this case, the plaintiffs raised specifically to reflect what Justice Alito and Justice Thomas have already written about the Indian Child Welfare Act. But we think that there are judges in the middle we can persuade. And we have to believe that this court is not willing to throw away 200 years of congressional policymaking because someone has decided that they think it's not right. The court has a long history of deferring to Congress when it comes to the decisions about Indian people and Indian tribes. And this would just be an earthquake if the court was to go the other way. So when we were coordinating the advocacy, we always ended those calls with, let's go win this case. And I feel confident that's what we can do. We can win this case. There was another part of this question I should answer.
I think
What
it
can we
was
do after Right.
Yeah.
And that depends on, there's so many issues in this case, so many ways that you might lose a little bit here or a little bit there. And it's going to depend on how each individual issue comes out. Some of them, there may be ways we can go back to Congress and write a fix. Some of them, that would be a lot harder.
Great. Thanks, Dan. David, did you want to add to that at all?
Just one really quick thing is, depending on, again, like Dan said, on what the kind of decision we get is, there's even potential to, state by state, develop responses to, and has already started talking to so depending on what the decision looks like, what kinds of support help can we provide tribes and states who want to try and pursue some of these other remedies. So we're already in those conversations too.
Great, thank you. Someone asked if there was a non-social media way to stay tuned. And I believe so. That is one way that you can stay tuned that is not social media. And then, are there particular news sites that y'all would recommend following for updates? I believe that also was answered in the chat. Yes. So it says news coverage on ICWA is not perfect, and they tend to not cover every development. Our Instagram page has the most regular updates, and we share positive coverage and opinion pieces. And that would be Protect ICWA on Instagram.
If I could take a minute, I'd like to highlight something that Professor Kim Park Nelson talked about in her comments. She talked about this system as being almost like a market. And I think that's important. One of the other arguments going on in this case is the plaintiffs saying that Congress's power is limited only to regulating Indian commerce. And the plaintiffs will glibly say that Indian children are not commerce. Now, I know it can sound crass to talk about children moving in commerce, but as a reality, those Indian schools 100 years ago were training children, Indian children, for particular types of jobs at the bottom end of the economy to create cheap labor. During the Indian adoption project that David described, you could walk into a church somewhere in the country and see a poster that said, you too can adopt an Indian child for only $50. And when Congress was debating the Indian Child Welfare Act, they described what they were seeing as essentially a gray market for Indian children. And so when Professor Nelson talks about the removal of one set of children from the equation, creating a need to find children elsewhere as being like a market, I think she's spot on in a way that the plaintiffs in this case don't want to acknowledge. We don't like to think of Indian children moving in commerce, but the reality is when someone is paying an agency tens of thousands of dollars and paying their lawyers thousands of dollars on top of that to perfect their adoption, that's kind of what's going on.
I just want to respond quickly to that, Dan. Thanks for sending me props. I appreciate it. I also want to note, in international adoption policy, there's this thing called the Hague Convention that's supposed to kind of like be this international agreement of all the signatory countries that kind of maintains like a single standard, I guess, to some degree for overseas, for cross-border adoption placements. And many of the requirements in the Hague Convention are very similar to what you see in the Indian Child Welfare Act. I mean, there's this strong preference written into the convention for family preservation, followed by a preference that children be if they need to be adopted, to be adopted domestically, and only when those options have failed, should children be considered for international adoption, with a number of kind of like steps and protections that are built in along the way. And so, I mean, I do think that in a lot of ways, if the United States gets rid of ICWA, it's there, as a country, or sort of would be pulling away from what is very agreed on at this point as international standards that are supposed to be focused on best interests of children.
Thanks to both of you, Dan and Kim, in highlighting that for those of us watching. So I think that's really important. And just noting that a lot of resources have been named in the chat, and we'll make sure that in the follow-up communication that those are collected for you all. And so we are actually moving to closing for the evening. Want to close by really thanking you all for joining us tonight. Again, if you have any more questions, and I'm sorry if we didn't get to yours, we have an email that you can connect with us, and we'll end with making sure to share the best way to contact us after this event. But as we close out, we want to ask you to do one last activity as a group. I want you to take a moment. Oh, we're not going to do that poll yet. What I want you all to do, is to actually take a moment and imagine us winning this case. Put yourself in time to November 9th. We're waiting to hear the decision, and then the announcement comes out that we finally heard that the Supreme Court made the right decision. We have protected ICWA as a group, and I want you to take a moment to manifest this victory in your mind right now. And as you imagine us winning this case as a group, and yourself in that place at that time, what feelings come up for you? Please use the chat to name some of those feelings, some of what maybe your body wants to do in that moment, if you're imagining our victory. Let me give you a minute to put some of those feelings and thoughts into the chat. Great. Yes, let's get your thoughts on our collective imagining of winning this case. I'm seeing relief, empowered, joy, tears of joy, whew, relief, hope, relief, slay, motivation, love, solidarity. Great, those are great. Thank you so much for taking the time to imagine together. I want you to hold on to that feeling and really let it drive you to take action, energize you, and be the feeling that you actually bring into conversations with other people outside of today's rally. When you leave this space, bring that energy there. And what we would love for you all to do is keep in mind this manifesting victory as you leave tonight's rally. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I loved seeing the feelings that we were feeling as we thought about that victory. Thank you to Sun Young Shin for opening our rally with your powerful words. Thank you, Dr. Kim Park Nelson, Dan Leverance, and David Simmons for speaking with us all. Thank you to our co-sponsors, Protect ICWA, Adoptee Bridge, Adoptee Hub, Adoptees for Justice, AK Connection, the Chinese Adoptee Alliance, Midwest Mixed, National Korean American Service and Education Consortium, and Sisters of China for helping us spread the word about this rally. Thank you all for joining us this evening and for supporting ICWA. And before you leave, we would love for you to share how you're going to take action following this rally. There is a poll. I believe it is up on your screen now. So if we just want to go in and let us know how you are going to be supporting ICWA. And again, there are so many ways to support and stay connected to Protect ICWA. As Margie said, let's manifest this victory and stay connected. Thank you all for joining and have a great evening. Let's go win this case.